In this week, we're going to continue with what we started in the previous week, namely using a JavaScript front-end framework, in our case, Svelte, to create data visualizations. And in the previous week, we already got quite far with that. We used the basic building blocks of Svelte's template syntax, specifically the each block, if you remember, to iteratively construct all of the elements in our basic Du Bois bar chart. We're going to move a little bit further in this week. Specifically, we're going to look at how event handlers work in within the Svelte template syntax. And we're also going to be experimenting with importing another library, in this case, from the d3.js ecosystem, to do what is often referred to as scaling or mapping. And what that means is that we're going to automatically calculate, if we have a variable, in our case, the population variable, automatically calculate what the width of the corresponding bar element or rectangle element should be. So far, we've just measured that on the original chart, but now we're going to calculate that in a more automatic way. So we'll see how that goes. We'll start with the event handlers, and then we'll move on from there. What we're also going to do is we're going to specifically use a local development environment this week. So we're still going to use Code Sandbox as a starting point. So it provides us a kind of a template to start from, but then we're going to download that starting point and make sure that our development server is set up locally as well. So to keep track of things, for the first kind of section, I've listed here our step-by-step approach, and we'll use that to kind of tick things off as we go along. So what we're going to do first is we're going to download our previous Code Sandbox. We're going to set up our local development environment, and then we're going to play around with the Svelte event handlers, specifically walking through these three steps listed here. They're also listed as kind of to-dos on our list here. So first, we're going to see how we can trigger a simple, straightforward console.log on a mouse event, let's say click. Then we're going to try and change the X position of rectangles upon clicking, and then ultimately we want to console log a message that's specific to the rectangle at hand. So let's say log the right year or the right population or something like that. So we'll see how that goes in practice. Event handlers in the Svelte syntax work a little bit simpler, I would say, than what we've done so far. So in week 4, we use the built-in vanilla JavaScript function called add event listener to basically tie a specific event, listening to a specific event, so let's say a click or a mouse over or a mouse end, to a specific HTML element. Or in our case, in many cases, these are SVG elements. So when you click on the rectangle, do this. That logic works quite similar in Svelte. So we have what is called the on::event name directive. So we can actually look at the Svelte documentation for that as well, which in some places can be pretty terse, but it does contain pretty much everything you need to know. So in the context of our graph, that pretty much looks like this. We decide which element we want to kind of bind this event handler to. So let's say that's a rectangle element, and then we just type on::click, and then we give it some reference to a function that gets executed upon click. So in this case, we have the do something function here that is defined between the script tags in our component. So let's see how that works in practice. But before we do that, let us download our starting point. And as a starting point, we're just gonna use what the end result of our previous week was. So I'm going to go to week 5, scroll all the way down just before the recap, and just look at the solution here. There we go. And I'm going to open that in its own window just so we can have a double check to make sure that that's the right starting point. If I go to app.svelte, I should see here in um, the template, indeed, we have that each block that, remember, iterates through each and every element in the data. Um, we refer to that as item, and then we can use the different properties of item to draw the graphic here in the bottom. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to download this, so I have to click File and then Export to Zip, so that will download an archive of the entire project. I'm seeing now a pop-up window with some instructions for me to save this zip file. I'm just going to save it to my downloads folder. So there we go. And then, as you can see here in the bottom of my my browser, it has downloaded. When I click on that, it will open and unzip that file, which is not visible to you right now. Now, once I've downloaded it and unzipped it, I'm going to switch over to Visual Studio Code. There we go. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to open that directory that I've just downloaded. So I go to File, and then I go to Open, and then I'm going to select this directory that I have just downloaded. I'm going to click Open, and then hopefully it will open. There we go. It does open. I can double check by clicking on app.svelte and just scrolling down. And indeed, we have here that same each logic. So that's good. So we have our project, we have our files, it's all in one location. Now, as you remember from our discussion over the past 2 weeks, to use a local development server, we also need to make sure that the dependencies of the project, so the libraries that the project is using, in our case, for example, the Svelte library, are downloaded and available within the project. And to do that, we're using this tool called npm, or the Node Package Manager. And to interface with that tool, we do that from the terminal. So we first have to open a new terminal. So I go Terminal, then New Terminal, and that should open here in the bottom of our window a terminal where we can type things. And in our case, what we want to do is first we want to install all of the dependencies. And after we do that, we can basically run our local development server, or local development environment. To install dependencies, I just type npm install. And what that does is it will go online, it will look in the, or first it will look in the project directory, it will find a list of dependencies, then it will go online and find the right location of all these dependencies, download them, which can take a while depending on your internet connection, and then it will install them. There we go. So that looks about right. And then after we have done that, we can run our development server, which we do by npm run. And then there's different commands we can give it. But in this case, we want to run the command def, which will start a development server. So when I do that, hopefully, there we go. It will give you a nice little rocket and say your application is ready. And specifically, it's ready on localhost and then port 5000. So I can actually have a look here and make sure that works. There we go. So that looks like our familiar Du Bois chart. And I'm just going to double check that my hot reloading also works. So just to find these two windows up here. So if I type something here and I save, then there you go. You should see that automatically the browser window will update accordingly. All right, so that's good. So just going back to our to-do list, what we have done is we have downloaded our code sandbox. We have also set up our local development environment. What we now want to do is we want to console log some message. It doesn't really matter what kind of message. If a mouse event, and let's stick with the click event for now, if a click event is triggered. All right, so how do we do that? So we go back to Visual Studio Code, And we know that in Svelte's template syntax, we have this on colon and then the event name syntax. So let's see how that works. In this case, let's do it on the rectangle because it's sort of the largest, it's the easiest to click on. So I can type on dot click and then equals, and then we do curly braces, and then within the curly braces, we type the name of the function, for example, that we want to execute. So we give it a reference of the function we want to execute. So I'm just gonna say do stuff, and we see here these little crinkly lines indicate a potential problem, and we can see that pop-up do stuff is not defined, and that's because this function is never declared. So what we go up to our script part of the component, and we actually go and we define that function do stuff, and it doesn't take any arguments for now. And within it, we do stuff because we console log do stuff. There we go. So I'm going to save this, and then my browser should have auto refreshed, and when I click, it should console log something. But I'm not actually displaying the console right now, so I'm going to bring that up here, and let's just clear the console. And now when I click on one of my bars, I should see, there you go, I should see a message popping up. Every time I click on one of these bars, you'll see that the incrementer counter here is incrementing. So that's good. So our first task, namely console log if specific mouse event is triggered, worked out. So that's pretty nice. Now our next task is to actually change the X position of the rectangle upon click. So let's expand on this logic and see how that works. So far what we did is we added this on colon click directive, and then we made reference to the do stuff function. Every time I click, that function gets executed. So if instead of just console logging do stuff, what if we actually did stuff within this function? So what we could do is we could maybe take that bar X position, which is currently a static value at 165 pixels, and let's say we say bar X position equals the previous bar X position plus 20. And what that should do is if we click on one of these bars, it should basically hop or jump 30 pixels to the, or 20 pixels to the right. So let's see if that actually works. Ooh, look at that. We have jumpy bars. So within the body of this function, we can do all kinds of logic. We don't just have to console log some random message. We can actually change some of these variables up here, and the chart will automatically update to reflect those changes. So we don't need to actually do anything else than updating that particular variable. All right, so we've done the second step as well. But so far, these examples are a little bit sort of trivial and are not actually so useful. What we would like to do, of course, is when we click on a rectangle, we want to do something, or we want to list something or show something that is specific to that rectangle. So how do we do that? Because so far we execute the same function for every single click. There's nothing unique to that rectangle. Now, what you might remember from when we did this in vanilla JavaScript, we can make reference to this do stuff function, but if we want to, for example, give some kind of argument to do stuff, let's say the index of our bar, remember we start at 0 and then every additional bar, the index gets incremented with 1. So instead of just console logging do stuff, I want to console log the current index, and let's just get rid of that jumping bar situation. Then if I do this now, it's console logging, but it's not actually showing the index. It's showing some stuff what looks like to be related to my mouse event. So why is that? Now that's because by default, when I am making reference to a function inside of any event handler, the argument that's given to that function, the first argument that's given to that function, is a series of properties or metadata about that actual event. That's what you see show up here now in the console. In this case, we don't actually want to do anything with that metadata. What we want to do is we want to do something with the I in this case, or maybe the item. So if I do stuff item, you would say that now it gives as the argument to our do stuff function the contents of whatever is an item, which will be changed on every iteration of the loop, right? So if I hit save here, what I now see is if I already see that there's stuff in my console here, so that looks a little bit weird. And when I click on any of these bars, nothing else is showing up. And why is that? It's because instead of now having a reference to this do stuff function for my event handler, I have actually just executed this function when the original element was created, because I'm not making reference to it anymore. Because I open and I close my parentheses, I'm actually executing it. It gets executed once when the rectangle is created. After that, nothing happens anymore. So how do I solve that? Instead of just executing this do stuff item function, I will have to basically encapsulate that in what is called an anonymous function. So I declare a new function, and within the body of that function, I execute the do stuff function. So this entire function now is only declared. It's not executed yet. It will only get executed when a click event is registered. So once I hit save, now I see that my console is nice and clean. And when I click, I now see that my item object is actually logged to the console. So this is what we call an anonymous function because it doesn't have a name. We don't need a name because we only need to use it in the context of this click function. Sometimes you might have seen kind of the short syntax for this, and that's the arrow syntax. So instead of typing this whole function syntax, I can also just type opening and a closing of the parentheses for the argument. In this case, we don't have an argument. And then this arrow, and then in this case, we don't even need the curly braces around it. So opening, closing, this can contain some arguments, arrow, and then the body of the function. In this case, that's only a single function call to do stuff. So this is just a shorter way of writing the same thing. So I can show you that if I save, we have the exact same effect. So going back to our to-do list, we now have been also able to console log a message specific to the rectangle being clicked on. So just a very quick recap, what we did is we started with the week 5 code sandbox, we downloaded it, we saved it to our local laptop, And then from Visual Studio Code, we open it, we install the necessary dependencies with npm install, and then we started a local development server with npm run dev. And then we walk through the first section of the class material, specifically walking through these three steps. First, just doing a normal console log, then actually moving the rectangles a little bit to the right on every click, and ultimately logging some information, some message specific to the rectangle being clicked on.